Right, okay people, here we go again. So this is one of those interviews that was recommended to me by another guest. Some of you might recall during my conversation with Johan Hari on his book Lost Connections. I think that was episode 53, I think, if people want to go check that out. He mentioned a couple of people that I should go away and try to get hold of and have a conversation with. And, well, I've managed to do that for today's episode. Today's guest is, I guess you could call him the star of chapter 9 in that book, where Johan explores the topic of childhood trauma. And so, yeah, today's topic, we're going to be talking about the adult manifestations of childhood trauma, or more specifically, I guess, the idea that emotionally traumatic childhood experiences can be sort of converted into organic disease later on in life. So my guest today is world-renowned physician and researcher, Dr. Vincent Felitti. Vincent is a clinical professor of medicine at the University of California, San Diego, and the founder of the Department of Preventative Medicine for Kaiser Permanente, where he served as the chief of preventative medicine for 26 years, during which time his department provided comprehensive medical evaluations to 1.1 million individuals, becoming the largest single-site medical evaluation facility in the Western world. Dr. Felitti has also served on the advisory committees at the Institute of Medicine and the American Psychiatric Association, but he is perhaps most famous for being the co-principal investigator of the world-famous Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACE study, which was a long-term, in-depth analysis of over 17,000 adults, investigating how our emotional experiences during childhood relate to and possibly influence our physical and mental health as adults. So, Vincent, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
You're welcome.
Okay, right. So I guess the best place to start with this is to go right back to the beginning. And I'm guessing it's such a, especially in psychology and just health and medicine in general, it's such a famous study. I'm guessing that you might be sort of sick to death of telling the backstory to this, but there are going to be people listening to this episode who have never heard of it. So I think it's important to provide a decent amount of context. And so we'll get into the study, the content of the study itself and some of the results later. But for now, if you could just sort of give us some background on the ACE study and take us right back to the very genesis of it, if you could, please.
Okay. Well, I'm an internist, and my background was in infectious disease work. And then after doing that for about 10 years in Kaiser Permanente, a very large American medical healthcare organization, I was asked to start a department of preventive medicine. And I set it up so that the first division, so-called health appraisal, provided uniquely comprehensive medical evaluation to any adult member who wished to undergo that process. And we did that, and it was quite successful and popular. And pretty soon it became obvious that some of the problems that we were turning up, obesity being one, were dealt with very poorly. So we decided to set up our own obesity program within the department. This was in the early 1980s. At that time, a new approach was being developed called supplemented absolute fasting, which involves a person to cease eating all food for very prolonged periods of time. And if that's all you do, then the Irish hunger strikers some years ago illustrated what happens with that you'll die in about 6 weeks if you solely drink water because of a major potassium and magnesium deficiency setting off lethal cardiac arrhythmias. All right, well, that's fairly easy to fix. You mix some potassium and magnesium in your glass of water every morning. And if you have the weight to carry you forward, people will next start dying at about 6 months. of amino acid deficiency, or a little more complicated, you would need to mix some amino acids in. And if people have the weight to carry them forward, they will next start dying in about 1 year of various vitamin deficiencies that most people have not even heard of anymore because they were resolved so effectively, of pellagra, very scurvy, etc. All right, so some multivitamins go in. That product was called Optifast. And if a person is going to cease eating all food and is sufficiently obese, then this is absolutely necessary to prevent death. It does not help a person lose weight. Not eating does that. This keeps you from dying when you cease eating all food for prolonged periods. That process we carried out with over 30,000 people over the years, very safely and very effectively. And it enables a person to take their weight down approximately 300 pounds in 1 year.
Wow.
That's an extraordinary concept. And so we thought, well, this is really wonderful. I mean, this is absolutely stunning what we're able to do. And saw it as a huge advance. Patients, however, much to our surprise, were terrified by the outcomes. And many fled the program, quickly regaining all of their weight. And I mean, this drove us crazy. You know, what the hell is going on? We're helping people do what they say they want to do, what they need to do, and they're fleeing and are terrified.
Vincent, how many people was it, that were sort of dropping out due to this particular reason?
I can't give you an exact number, but it was certainly a significant portion.
Yeah.
You know, somewhere in the range of a third.
Wow.
So exploring this led us slowly into the very counterintuitive realization that obesity was beneficial in ways that we had never thought of, that it was sexually protective, that it was physically protective, that it was socially protective. Now, it's also the opposite of those things, but there are some people with certain needs. And one memorable patient came in weighing 408 pounds at age 28, and we took her from 408 to 132 in 51 weeks. She stayed there several weeks, and then in 1 3-week period regained 37 pounds, which I had not conceived as being physiologically possible. And I remember asking her, you know, what's going on? I think I'm sleep eating. What do you mean? Well, when I was a kid, I was a sleepwalker. I haven't done that for years, but I have been doing that when I go to bed at night. Everything is clean and put away in the kitchen. I wake up in the morning, boxes and dishes are dirty, boxes and cans are open, pots and dishes are dirty. I'm the only person there. Somebody's obviously been cooking and eating there. It has to be me, but I have no recollection. But why now? Well, I don't know. But what do you think? And we went through this a couple of times with the I don't know and what do you think? And then she says to me, well, there was this man at work. He was a much older man, you understand. He was married. And he said to me, hey, Patty, you look pretty good. You lost all that weight. How about you and me making it every week? Making it being an American slang expression for having intercourse. And that was the day the sleep eating began. And I remember thinking, well, it's a pretty crummy proposition, but this is 1986. It is Southern California. It's kind of an extreme response. You know, why the extreme response? And pursuing that in about 5 minutes led to her telling me about how at age 10, her grandfather started having vaginal intercourse with her and did so for roughly the next decade. And that was when the weight gain began.
So
this turned out to be a common pattern.
Right.
I mean, you know, at the time, I naively thought, well, this is the second incest case I've seen in then 23 years of practice. Little did I know, about 10 days later, I stumbled into another such case, and then started asking people in our obesity program routinely about childhood sexual abuse. And it seemed every other person I was asking was acknowledging such a history. Believe me, I had great difficulty accepting this, thinking, no, I must be doing something wrong. I mean, this is so outrageous, people would know. Somebody would have told me. Wasn't that what medical school was for? Ultimately, after a number of months of confirming this with relatives, police departments, etc., I was convinced this was real, but that people didn't want to know. And as we went down that trail of childhood sexual abuse, we got histories of other forms of abusive experience in childhood: frequent beatings, major neglect, alcoholic parents or drug abusers in the house, etc. And ultimately, the question came up, is this simply some uniquely aberrant group that I've managed to somehow accumulate, or does this have any relevance to a general population? And as a result of my presenting this at a national obesity meeting in Atlanta in 1990, where I was attacked by the audience, I met someone from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, the very large government health organization in this country. And they said to me, look, if what you're saying is true, it's got enormous importance for the country as well as the practice of medicine. But nobody's going to believe your 286 cases, no matter how well you've studied them. What we need is a large epidemiologically sound study with thousands of people in it. And so by the time dinner was over, we decided, 26,000, we could handle that. And so we spent the next 2 years figuring out what we were going to do, how we were going to do it, etc. Submitted the proposal to the Institutional Review Board. All medical research in this country since the Nuremberg trials has had to go through an approval board, basically to keep anyone from, reinstituting Nazi-style medical experiments. And it was turned down flat. But otherwise sensible people said to us, you can't use that questionnaire. You're going to cause patients to decompensate by asking those questions, maybe occasionally become suicidal. So we spent the next 9 months battling that point, finally getting agreement, and then proceeding with the study. In 1995, we began the study. And we asked 26,000 consecutive adults coming through for comprehensive medical evaluation if they would help us understand more about how life experiences in childhood might affect adult health and well-being. And of those, 17,500 agreed to help us, understanding that we would also be following them forward for the next 20 years.
Okay, so sorry, Vincent. Let me just jump in now before we get into the actual the study itself, because there's just a couple of questions that have sort of popped up for me there that I'd like to investigate. The first one is you said it a couple of times then that people didn't want to, when you were making this discovery about the connection between obesity and childhood abuse. You mentioned that people didn't want to know about this, and that when you presented it to an audience, that you were basically attacked by the audience. And I'm just wondering what the nature of that was. Why do you think that was the case, the sort of reluctance to believe what was being presented?
I think a very big piece of it lies in the fact that we have all been taught very effectively as small children that nice people don't talk about certain things, and my God, surely don't ask questions about them.
Right.
What kid trying to learn about sex ever asked his mother or father if they really had sexual intercourse with each other, what was it like, how often they did it, etc.?
Okay.
And it's and yet no parent has ever said explicitly, you must not ever ask that question. I mean, it's a quite revealing insight into unconscious forces that go on in all of our lives.
Do you think any of it was maybe to do with, as well, there could be sort of a reverse correlation, that maybe people will be worried that with this being such a sort of prevalent factor, that then it could be turned around and say, well, because you're obese, you're overweight, therefore you may have been abused. Maybe there was reluctance from that perspective as well.
I think that sometimes happens, but not very often. In fact, what we found was that oftentimes people were relieved that someone finally understood what was going on.
Right.
I mean, when we ask patients these questions explicitly, and this is a key point, not face to face initially, but by an inert mechanism, by a very lengthy general medical history questionnaire into which these abuse questions were integrated, filled out at home. Ultimately, over a multi-year period, 440,000 adults filled that out, going through our department. And in the exam room, when we met them for the first time, but having the results in hand of this lengthy questionnaire they filled out at home, so we knew where we needed to go further, where we didn't need to go further. The typical approach was, I see on the questionnaire that. Can you tell me how that's affected you later in your life? And we listened, period. Right. We did one other thing, but it took a while to understand that. We implicitly accepted. And that was a very big issue with patients. That we allowed them to tell somebody important to them, a doctor or a nurse practitioner, something deeply shameful about themselves, typically for the first time in their lives. And they realized minutes later that they were still accepted by this person.
Well, I think you might have sort of maybe already answered my next question when you talked about asking these questions where people answered these questions at home on a questionnaire rather than face to face in person. But I was just wondering, when you got that first rebuttal from the ethics committee, I was wondering how you eventually got past that, because that idea of bringing up past traumas and that it might trigger an episode of depression or suicide or something like that. That's a legitimate concern. So I was just interested how you eventually got past that.
It's really not a legitimate concern to people who are knowledgeable in these areas.
All right, okay.
Because things like depression and so forth, their association is basically from repression. Being able to speak openly with somebody about that and being accepted by that person still. They were still nice to me. They wanted to see me again, etc. Is a remarkable relief when you have been concealing something for half a century.
Right. Okay. God, that's probably a topic I could do all of its own, an episode on that, I think, at some point. Okay. So let's go into the study itself now, and I'm particularly interested in what some of the results were. So if you could take me through the highlights for you of the study, the way it went, the way it was executed, and some of the results of it that tell the most, that paint the most informative picture.
Sure. In this study, we took the 10 most common categories of adverse childhood experience that we were running into in our obesity program. Okay, not the only 10 in the world, but this was from a clearly middle-class population. Average age 57, 80% white, including Hispanic, 10% Black, 10% Asian, almost exactly half women, half men. 74% had been to college. Everybody employed with high-end medical insurance, etc. So clearly a middle-class population.
Okay.
Now, if we had a population that recently had come from Somalia or from Cambodia or some war-torn part of the earth, there might well have been other categories, but this was in a clearly middle class population, the 10 most common, and it really was extraordinary, their prevalence. We began with childhood sexual abuse. 28% of the women and 16% of the men acknowledged a history of contact childhood sexual abuse. Okay? Other categories: major humiliation, recurrent humiliation, neglect, major emotional neglect, major physical neglect, growing up in a home without both biological parents, growing up in a home where one of the members of your household was imprisoned during your childhood or adolescence, in a home where mother was treated violently, in a home where one of the members of your household was an alcoholic or a drug user, etc. So there were 10 categories that we picked, and it was totally, beyond our initial belief as to the prevalence that these things were being acknowledged. And as I mentioned before, initially they were checked out. I remember calling the sheriff's office in a small town in Mississippi to check on a story that someone had told me. And, oh yeah, Doc, I know that family. What she's saying is true, etc. So this was real stuff, plus the fact nobody falsely creates an incest history for social aggrandizement.
Right.
That's correct.
The thing that's the results that I'm most interested in, Vincent, are, firstly, I'm interested in just what was the prevalence of somebody experiencing at least one trauma, or another way you might be put it is how many people actually managed to get through childhood and be completely fine.
Good point. We created a so-called ACE score. We were dealing with mountains of information at this point, and we needed some way of simplifying it. And so we decided first that we would create an ACE score so that we could have a numeric reference point. And the ACE score would be the sum of the number of different categories of events, not experiences. In other words, if somebody were molested 32 times, that was 1 point for the category. If you grew up with an alcoholic and a drug user in the household, that was 1 point for the category. So the so-called ACE score is the sum of the number of categories experienced, not the number of events experienced.
Okay. Sorry, Vincent. Is there any reason why... Well, I was going to say, is there any reason why you measured the type of the event instead of the frequency of events? I mean, the obvious thing that springs to mind is, retrospectively, it's going to be difficult to count how many times these things happened, but it still seems like there's I guess you could argue that somebody that maybe had a traumatic incident happen the once would probably be less traumatized than somebody who experienced that same event for maybe an entire decade of the life.
No question. This was a point that was raised by my partner at the CDC, Dr. Robert Anda, and he astutely realized that this data was so threatening to people that people routinely would be trying to find some way of diminishing its validity, get this stuff away from me. And he brought up the obvious point that you're bringing up. You mean to tell me that 50 years after the fact, somebody can accurately remember whether they were molested 14 times or 9 times? Come on, this data isn't worth the damn. Get rid of it. Just throw this away. So that was the reason we made that choice. It understates the power of the association, if anything.
It understates the power of the association.
Yeah, because we're taking what oftentimes was a great multiplicity of occurrences and reducing it to one for the category.
Right, of course, yes.
Now, the first question that you asked about prevalence, 67% of this clearly middle class group experienced at least one of the 10 categories in their childhood or adolescence. And 11% of them, 1 in 9 people, experienced 5 or more of the categories.
Right, okay. So the interesting thing about this data isn't so much these figures as they stand on their own. It's this association that later came between the prevalence of the adverse childhood experiences
and their association with major biomedical disease, with premature death, etc.
Yeah, so the thing I'm wondering there, Vincent, is whether this always the idea going in, was to, due to these early findings between childhood abuse and then obesity, was the idea to purposefully seek out these associations between the childhood experience and the adult health outcomes.
Yes.
And was it also to find the associations between adult physical health, or was mental health included in this as well?
Both. But the magnitude of the associations and the breadth of the associations was totally and recurrently a surprise to all of us. For instance, the association with obesity was where this began, so we were quite familiar with that. I mean, in obesity, there are 2 issues. One is the use of food for its psychoactive benefits. Sit down, have something to eat, you'll feel better. Nobody asks, when you ate last. That's a truism. Sit down and have something to eat, you'll feel better. Okay. Well, there are some people that need a hell of a lot of feeling better, and food works. It's not the only thing that works, but it's certainly common and easily accessible. Then there will be people who find that obesity has major benefits. Well, I remember in the early days talking with a woman, we're going through her life, how old were you, when, etc. We get to age 23. She tells me that at 23 she was raped, and in the year subsequent gained 105 pounds. Whereupon she looks down at the carpet and mutters to herself, overweight is overlooked, and that's the way I need to be.
Wow.
Okay, I mean, this is not somebody that someone would sensibly send to a dietitian to learn how to eat right.
Yeah. See, the thing that's sort of interesting there as well, Vincent, is so we've got these the adverse experiences which then result in, say, obesity, which is sort of, it may be conscious or unconscious that this protective mechanism is maybe kicking in. But then there's also associations with things like cancer and heart disease, which are...
Absolutely.
Yeah, so, I mean, if you could take us through some of those as well, because they seem a bit more counterintuitive.
Sure. The easy association would be with smoking. Okay, the benefits of smoking have been known for about a century. Not casual knowledge, but explicit. It's been known for a long time that nicotine has potent anti-anxiety activity. It has appetite suppressant activity. American Indians figured out empirically centuries ago that it has anger suppressant activity. In their ceremonial peace pipe, they were burning tobacco leaves, not oak leaves or moss. Not only that, but the benefits, the psychoactive benefits, occur within 15 or 20 seconds of inhalation. The risks are major. They're 15 or 20 years away. I think most of us understand, if the screws are on tight enough, give me that pack of smokes now. I'll worry about 20 years from now next week when things have calmed down. So that was an easy association. When we saw the association between ACE score and subsequent malignancy, that was what jumped to our mind. Well, yeah, you smoke 3 packs a day to feel better, of course. And that's true, but it was just a little piece of it. There is a remarkable book available on Amazon and the internet. It's probably the most open autobiography that I can imagine. It was written by a woman who had a lengthy, was the incest victim of her father for many years as a little girl. Worse yet, he used to bring her into saloons at nighttime and sell her to strangers for sex. Somehow she did not commit suicide. She did not become a mass murderer. She graduates high school, gets a scholarship to college, graduates college, gets a scholarship to law school, graduates law school, ultimately becomes a United States federal judge. That's a big deal. It would be very easy to say, isn't it wonderful that that poor little girl with that hideous history is so resilient? And that opens up the issue of resilience, which is very popular because it's a way of minimizing things. Well, the kid's only 2. He's not going to remember. Kids are resilient. It'll be okay, etc. She has had 5 different kinds of cancer, not 5 relapses, but 5 different kinds of cancer and 2 autoimmune diseases. She has multiple sclerosis and lupus. The relationship to cancer is an interesting and complex one, and vastly more complex than, what we initially thought. Well, yeah, you smoke 3 packs a day. She never smoked. The causality there is we all form cancer cells at a low level every day. Our immune systems recognize them in the background and destroy them, and we never know the difference. Let's move now to organ transplantation for the rest of the understanding. Everyone knows if you get an organ transplant, you need to be on lifetime immunosuppression so you don't reject the organ. Some people will correctly have heard that one of the side effects of lifetime immunosuppression is an increased risk of cancer at some point in the future. That's because we're all forming cancer cells at a low level in the background, our immune systems destroy them, etc. But with lifetime immunosuppression, our immune systems are no longer destroying them. So these things that ordinarily would be destroyed now are free to grow. So she has had 5 different kinds of cancer. I mean, that's a rarity. In 50 years, I have never seen a patient before her with 5 different kinds of cancer. Same thing with autoimmune diseases. One of the effects of so-called traumatic stress that is so major that it has an ongoing unconscious effect on people, is hyperstimulation of certain areas of the brain that alter the immune system in other ways, such that autoimmune diseases occur and you start forming antibodies against your own tissues. We studied 21 different autoimmune diseases. Examples would be like rheumatoid arthritis, like scleroderma, a whole slew of them, multiple sclerosis, lupus I mentioned, etc. And we found a clear relationship, a dose-response relationship between ACE score and 16 of those 21 different autoimmune diseases. That was really a real eye-opener.
Yeah, one of the more interesting things about this, for anyone that's maybe not necessarily convinced of this and could maybe conjure up some other cause and effect relationship or say that, correlation doesn't necessarily equals causation. I think it's called, this dose response curve. So I've got a few of these figures here, and some of the what would they be called? The illnesses, counterproductive or destructive behaviors that people might engage in adult life. So people with a zero ACE score, 1 in 16 of those people smoke. People with an ACE score of 3, it's 1 in 9, and people with an ACE score of 7+, it's 1 in 6.
Sure.
Yeah, for alcoholics, again, with a ACE score of 0, it's 1 in 69. An ACE score of 3, it's 1 in 9, and an ACE score of 7+, it's 1 in 6. And again, for IV intravenous drug use, 1 in 480 with a 0 ACE score, 1 in 43 with an ACE score of 3, and then 1 in 30 for people with an ACE score of 7+. That's super interesting. And I've got to say, Vincent, you see, some of the things I wanted to question you about with regards the sort of the methodology of the study, these figures seem to sort of undermine the questions I've got, to be honest. But I'm going to go ahead and ask them anyway, because I do think they're important. So the first one, which is the idea that the questionnaire is sort of devoid of context. Some of the questions are devoid of context. So, for instance, one of the questions is, were your parents ever separated or divorced? Now, someone that answers yes to that would get an ACE score of 1, but then they would have an ACE score of 1 regardless of the fact that it's possible that the divorce for them in the context of their family was a good thing. Maybe there was one parent that was violent, or that they didn't get on with, or maybe the parents just had a fraught relationship, and then as a result of the divorce, it improved the family dynamic. I mean, the same could be said for another question is about if a household member has ever been to prison. And I'm just wondering how we kind of account for that. Somebody given an ACE score of 1 based on potentially a positive experience, because then, especially because the study is so big, 17,000 people, that has the potential to skew the results to a certain extent.
Well, let me see if I can answer you this way. When we saw the range of background to answers in, whether you were raised by both biological parents or not, we saw that if the answer was no, then the least damaging answer was to have lost a parent by death, as long as that death was not a suicide. And because that at least allowed the creation of a protective mythology. My father would have protected me if, my mother would have cared for me if. The most destructive manner of not having both biological parents raise you was maternal abandonment. Mom split when we were 3 and we never heard from her again. An overwhelming loss. I mean, you think an animal in the woods loses its mother, most likely it's not going to be alive 24 hours later. So all of those things are encompassed, but they're really very minor fluctuations given the overall dynamic that's going on, because the magnitude of the forces is so huge. For instance, with an ACE score of 6 or higher, the likelihood of attempting suicide at some point later in your life is between 3,100 and 5,000% greater than it is at ACE score 0.
Yeah, well, just to throw these exact figures out, Vincent, this is another shocking one, really. 0 ACE score is 1 in 96 attempted suicides. ACE score of 3 is 1 in 10, and then an ACE score of 7+ is 1 in 5.
Yeah, sure. And I remember, the epidemiologists at the CDC telling me that those were numbers, the magnitude of which they see once in a career. But this verges on an interesting point, you see, a public health paradox. For instance, IV drug use. The ACE score 6 or higher, the likelihood of becoming an IV drug user is 4,600% greater than it is at ACE score 0. That was the number that, the epidemiologist told me, these are numbers, the magnitude of which we see once in a career. Okay. So in this country, at least, and perhaps in Britain as well, but in this country, at least, the most common street drug is methamphetamine, crystal meth.
Yes.
Everybody knows, bad stuff, dangerous, you could die from it, etc. Virtually no one seems to remember that the first successful prescription antidepressant introduced for sale in the United States in 1940 was methamphetamine by Burroughs Wellcome and Company.
I did not know that.
Does that mean anything that the most commonly used street drug is an antidepressant? Well, it's a lot easier to say, my kid's on that damn crystal meth because there's a dealer on the block than it is to say my kid's buying antidepressants on the street, which is likely to trigger the really why. Not a comfortable question to have to face.
Mm. A second question that I saw being raised a couple of times was the sort of the justification for the age range. So I believe the study was asking people between the ages of, well, as far back as they remember from birth up to the age of 18 years old. And yes, I'm just wondering what the justification of 18 being the cutoff point, because, some people would consider 18 to be somebody that's already an adult. And also there's the issue of by the time you're 18, you conceptualize experiences and experience them differently than you would as a child, and your memories of them would be more fresh. So, yeah, over to you on that.
Well, we had to put a limit somewhere. It could have been 17, could have been 23, 0 to 18 in this country. 18 is the end of adolescence, etc. So that was why, in my mind, that's a relatively trivial point. The real issue was that in childhood, however you choose to define it arbitrarily, in childhood, these histories were so totally unexpected. These experiences were things that most people, assumed, if they occur, they're really rare. And instead, they turn out to be remarkably common, except that you have to ask everybody. And it's really pretty unthinkable to ask questions like this. So that was our original driving point, that this stuff that was going on in childhood was so unexpected and unknown. And then as we started going down that trail, finding more than just childhood sexual abuse. 28% of women in a clearly middle-class population, that's kind of extraordinary. How does this play out later? Well, that was part of what the ACE study was about, to find out how it does play out later.
Yeah, well, that sort of brings us on to one of the bigger questions I've got about all this is, so things like the so-called war on drugs and everything's called a war on something, the war on diabetes or obesity, etc., etc.
Yeah, and they have been miserable failures.
They have been miserable failures.
And a good analogy here is house fires. When a house is burning down, the obvious manifestation is the smoke billowing out. And we can only thank God that fire departments understand that when they're called, the thing they treat is not the obvious manifestation. Otherwise, they'd be bringing big fans to treat house fires and blow the smoke away and making the house burn down faster.
Well, that's in Vincent. Do you think the results of this study are strong enough to make that argument that the so-called war on drugs and the war on obesity or whatever that one's called, that the results of this are strong enough to say that those government initiatives are misguided and that we need to be focusing our attention and funding elsewhere?
Yes. I would say there's a public health paradox in that many of our most common and intractable public health problems are indeed that from a societal standpoint, but from the standpoint of the individuals involved, are typically unconsciously attempted solutions to problems that the rest of us know nothing about. Because we have all been very effectively taught as children that nice people don't talk about certain things, and my God, surely don't ask questions about them.
But what would your... I know it's a big question. Let's put you in the White House for a moment. What would a reevaluation of the situation look like? It's, like you say, at the macro level, this is a societal problem, and if the results are strong enough to suggest that we start looking at this from a different perspective, what does that look like? How do we begin to do that?
Well, I'll tell you a brief story about a patient who I thought was remarkably insightful in this regard. This is a woman who's extensively molested as a child. She treated that successfully by 3-pack-a-day smoking. Successfully in the sense that it reduced her anxiety and it kept her slender. She gets married, and at age 35, her husband convinces her to stop smoking for her health. She stops smoking. She weighs 130 pounds. Suddenly, she is flooded with male sexual attention that she's never had to deal with before, because she explains to me, when you smoke 3 packs a day, there's a cloud of smoke around you that keeps people at a certain distance. She doesn't know how to deal with this, having no experience with it growing up, etc. Becomes very anxious, eats to reduce her anxiety. Her weight goes from 130 to 310 pounds. At 310 pounds, she goes into acute and chronic respiratory failure because the lung damage from her 3-pack-a-day smoking, which was tolerable at 130 pounds, she cannot handle at 310. And she has to be on oxygen 24 hours a day. So she lives this way for about, I think it was 18 years or something like that. She comes into our obesity program, and we take her from 310 to 150, and she no longer needs the oxygen. And, we who had not yet figured out exactly what we were doing with the obesity program, are sitting there proudly, oh, isn't this wonderful? She doesn't need the oxygen anymore. She's lost all that weight. The male sexual attention comes back. She is again petrified and consciously, usually this happens unconsciously, but she consciously makes the decision to get back over 300 pounds and accept the fact that she's going to be on oxygen 24 hours a day the rest of her life. And I have a video interview with her where she makes this memorable comment. It's important to realize that weighing 310 pounds and smoking 3 packs a day are not the problem. They're the symptoms of the problem. But it's a good analogy to the house fire metaphor, that we treat the most obvious manifestation, and sometimes that has nothing to do with the causality.
I guess one of the problems with it, Vincent, is I think when you start to say people taking drugs, engaging in promiscuous behaviour or becoming overweight, there's a high potential there that these are protective mechanisms or coping strategies. But I can imagine that a lot of people would be skeptical about that and say that's just an excuse. It's just an excuse for, pigging out on fast food and being lazy, or it's just an excuse for engaging in promiscuous behaviour. It's just an excuse to take drugs or whatever. And I'm just wondering how we'd manage to get past that, because, even now with mental health, it's part of the zeitgeist. Everybody's talking about it. It's sort of having its moment, but still, there's plenty of people out there that will say, depression doesn't exist. Just, back yourself about, sort yourself out, and put a smile on your face. That's still a very common opinion that people have. So I'm just wondering, this seems be even more difficult to get past.
Yeah, well, the underlying causality of the issues that I'm talking about are quite threatening to people, and that's why they try to avoid them.
What do you mean by threatening? Why? Specifically for the general public, why is it a threatening message or a threatening issue to confront?
Because it raises issues that we have been taught not to think about, not to talk about, etc.
Do you think it's also something to do with society having to face up to the depravity that maybe exists within it as well?
Oh, I think that's all part of the same thing, sure. The biggest social advance, the biggest biomedical advance I can think of in current times Would not be a vaccine for AIDS or anything like that, important though those are. It would be to figure out how to improve parenting skills across a nation.
Okay. That's yeah, I can imagine that's going to be quite a controversial statement to make, isn't it?
Of course.
Even though I agree with it as well.
Yeah.
I guess one of the things that might be tricky is there's a sort of vicious cycle effect that should maybe be taken into consideration as well, in that the people that are, the parents that are guilty of bad parenting, whether it's through, they're drinking themselves, or they're taking drugs, or engaging in promiscuous behavior, whatever.
Sure.
There's a high possibility then that those people themselves that are guilty of the bad parenting are victims of some sort of adverse childhood experience themselves.
Absolutely.
And so, I guess to a certain extent, I'm wondering what would you say that people can do maybe at an individual level, because there seems something very sort of fatalistic about it, almost to the extent that, even though this isn't necessarily what the figures show, just the idea that, well, someone might sit down, do this questionnaire, and at home on their own, not officially with you guys, and go, well, I've got an ACE score of 5 out of 10, so I'm sort of doomed. Like I'm gonna, say maybe it's a teenager and maybe think that they're gonna go into adulthood and start taking drugs and they're gonna die sooner or whatever. There's a sort of fatalism to it, and I'm just wondering how, as an individual, what can you do as the victim of adverse childhood experiences to sort of step out of that and not become part of that vicious cycle?
To find someone whom one can discuss this with, right, openly. Better yet, a small group of people. We ran the obesity program as a group session. So if people wanted to come into the program, they had to come weekly to a 2-hour meeting with the same group of people for 6 months. And in that program, we did not teach people anything. We asked them questions to help them discover what they knew at some deep level themselves, to bring it to consciousness and share it with other people. For instance, early in the program, I used to ask the group of a dozen or so people, we all have had the experience of seeing people lose a great deal of weight, only quickly to regain it. Why does that happen? And always 6 or 8 people in the group would blurt out, because if you don't deal with the underlying issues, it'll come back. What? Underlying issues? You mean we don't have to send you to a dietitian to learn how to eat right? Another one was, what are the benefits of obesity? And the answers always came in 3 categories, not the risks. The risks are real. You get some government pamphlet, you could read about them. The benefits. It's sexually protective. Put on 150 pounds if you're a woman who's had bad experiences. People are not going to be very interested in you anymore. It's physically protective, or at least provides the illusion of that. I remember in the early days, we had 2 men in the program who were guards at the state penitentiary downtown. One lost 100 and the other 150 pounds. They were both nice enough to openly say they were no longer comfortable walking into the cell blocks normal size. They felt a lot safer going in looking big as a refrigerator.
Yeah.
And you think of the expression, at least in this country, throwing my weight around.
Mm.
And the third category is that people expect less of you. You show up for a job weighing 350 pounds, people will assume you're stupid, lazy, what have you. Now, most people are not looking for people to have reduced expectations of them, but a distinct minority are, and that plays in. So it's really interesting. If one were to try to disseminate this information, so that it was acceptable and credible to people as opposed to threatening, which it is now, one way would be to put together a radio show and interview patients repeatedly, to have them tell the story. When I lecture about the ACE study, a key piece of all of my presentations is not me, not some guy in a suit from out of town, saying these disturbing things, but video clips of patients making the points themselves. This old lady, weighing 300 pounds with nasal oxygen clips in, saying it's important to realize that weighing 300 pounds and smoking 3 packs a day are not the problem. They're the symptoms of the problem. Like the smoke billowing out of the house is not the problem. It's the symptom of the problem.
Now, the thing about this idea of it's the main problem with these traumatic experiences is keeping them bottled up, so to speak.
Yes.
And the best thing to do is to find somebody to talk to about them, which, I guess to some people that might sound like a bit like airy-fairy, a bit of a platitude. So I was wondering if as part of maybe the ACE study that's maybe ongoing, I assume, or follow-up studies, I'm wondering if there's any actual data on that where we've had people that have had a high ACE score that have gone on to talk about it, share their experiences with a therapist or a group or whatever, and what the later health outcomes were in comparison to people that maybe haven't done
I can give you one early example.
Okay.
I mean, there's a great deal that still, needs to be done, but this is an early, very interesting example. I guess around the year 2000, our first publication was in 1998. We have had, I think, 86 publications out since then. Around the year 2000, when it was obvious that we had stumbled into something of major magnitude that was not, willingly accepted by our colleagues to integrate into medical practice, I decided that I would integrate these ACE questions into the general medical questionnaire that everyone coming through health appraisal had to fill out. And that was at that point 58,000 adults a year. It was a very large operation. My colleagues assured me I was crazy. No, you can't ask patients questions like that. My God, they'll be furious and no one will tell you the truth anyway. Well, I did it. And ultimately we did it with 440,000 adults over a multi-year period.
Wow.
Not one patient complaint, number of colleague complaints, like what the hell am I supposed to do with this information, etc. That kind of thing. After a couple of years, everything's going smoothly. A friend of mine brings by a German mathematician from the University of California. This guy has a startup data mining company that now is on the New York Stock Exchange. And he offers as a gift to do a 130,000 patient study, 2.5 years throughput for health appraisal, to see whether the addition of these questions to our already extensive general medical history questionnaire has any discernible impact. Incredibly, he discovers that it triggers a 35% reduction in doctor office visits the next year and an 11% reduction in emergency room visits.
Wow.
So hearing that, people say to me, 35, how'd you do that? You sent everyone to therapy, right? No, we essentially sent no one to therapy. Well, how'd you do that? Spent a lot of time thinking, how did we do that? And ultimately, interestingly, I saw that we had created a lay analogy to confession in the Catholic Church. And I'm not saying that as a religious person because I'm not. But confession is a very interesting process. It's been in use for 1,800 years, suggesting, maybe it meets some basic human need. And in that process, someone is enabled to tell somebody important to them, a priest, something deeply shameful about themselves typically for the first time in their lives, and come out of that a couple of minutes later realizing that they, are still accepted here. And we did the same thing, but we enabled a patient to tell a doctor or a nurse practitioner something deeply shameful about themselves, typically for the first time in their lives, and still be accepted by this person.
Yeah, what's interesting there, Vincent, on a couple of fronts, really. The first thing that reminds me of is because you're saying this is in the form of a questionnaire. I'm not sure if you're familiar with James Pennebaker.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, well, just quickly for the listeners, he researches the idea of writing down traumatic experiences
autobiographical writing. And I have been using his approach since the late 1980s. When I first heard about it, so I'll say to a patient, you own a computer? Yeah. Use email? Okay. So before you come back and see me, I want you to send me by email a detailed autobiography of the first 5 years of your life, and we're going to move forward in 5-year segments. And about 80% of people do that. I mean, the most I ever got was 264 pages total of single-space typing from a former Miss Pittsburgh who quickly convinced me that if one had a daughter, you don't let her enter a Miss Anything contest, lest she'd be the victim of every lecherous businessman in town.
Yeah, you see, again, with Pennebaker's work, that showed it's not just airy-fairy, that showed statistically there was a reduction in various illnesses and visits to the doctor. Yeah. And the other thing is, I'm not sure if you're familiar with something I think it might only be going on over here at the moment. I don't think it's maybe reached the US yet, but there's something called the Power Threat Meaning Framework, which is a sort of, it's an alternative conceptualization of psychiatric diagnosis, something that like a small team of people over in the UK, Lucy Johnston, people will be familiar, she's been on the podcast, she sort of headed this up. And the idea behind that, Vincent, is the broad philosophy of it is to stop asking what's wrong with people and to start asking what happened to you.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. And, sure. And so, again, with, along with with this research and the PTMF that people are working on at the moment and trying to change where therapists are focusing with their patients, it starts to feel like maybe this is, maybe this whole idea is maybe picking up some steam. And just on that front, I'm just wondering whether, because like you say, it's been 20 years since you first did this study, but you're still saying that people find these ideas threatening. So I'm just wondering how much progress you think is being made on this front and whether you actually see a sort of a paradigmatic or a conceptual change going on with the way that not just clinicians and professionals, but the general public view this idea of childhood trauma and the later effects that it might have.
There are indeed changes occurring, but not in places that I had anticipated. I anticipated they would occur in medical practice. It has largely been repressed, avoided in medical practice. It has taken off in this country most rapidly in school systems, in judicial systems. I recently spoke at a major judicial meeting in the state of Florida, and I was amazed at the extent to which this had spread through the judicial system in that state, because the judges saw it as a way of understanding why people were in their courtrooms. What was the underpinnings of social malfunction that brought them into the court system. Police departments, state legislatures who see it as having important impact on the potential cost of medical care to states. The 35% reduction in doctor office visits and 11% reduction in emergency room visits, specifically. The World Health Organization has been using the ACE study questionnaire annually with 20 European countries and 8 Asian countries, including China. 20 state legislatures in this country have passed legislation designed to support the routine collection of this information in medical practice. How realistic that is, is another matter. But the fact that that level of interest was there in 20 state legislatures is, an impressive thing. So it's making progress, but it's making progress in unexpected settings and unexpected ways. There has not been patient resistance. When we put the questions into the general medical history questionnaire, I got a number of letters of thanks from patients. A memorable one from an old lady who writes on line paper in pencil, "Thank you for asking. I feared I would die and no one would ever know what had happened."
A couple of questions before we before we move into the quickfire questions.
Yeah.
Just to sort of wrap things up that just sort of that left hanging for me, I guess. One is, I'm wondering how an acknowledgement of this idea of what's happened to people. Why do they do the things they do? Why are they in the situation that they're in? Why is their health the way it is? What's happened to them? How do we mesh that, taking that into consideration, with the idea of personal responsibility? Because, yes, people have had a bad childhood and bad things have happened to them, but there has to be some level of responsibility there, particularly when people are later engaging in behaviours that are maybe harming others, and like we were talking about before, maybe harming their own children and sort of passing this traumatic torch, so to speak. And I'm just wondering how we marry those two ideas in a way that the pendulum doesn't swing too far one way or the other.
I surely don't have any quick answer to that. It's an important question, but a complex one. Obviously, to a substantial degree, personal responsibility is defined by laws, but that basically escapes the complexity of the issue underlying all of that. A good example, however, of what you're talking about is the issue of childhood onset obesity, which has a very high correlation with parental divorce that is totally unspoken. I have never seen anything about this, in any meaningful article in the literature. But when you start talking with large numbers of people, how old were you when you first began putting on weight? Those who began putting on weight in childhood, there's a remarkable correlation with parental divorce.
Right, okay. The last question I've got, I guess, is I'm wondering if there's anything, is there any sort of discernible or qualitative difference between, or should I say an observable difference between those people that score high on the ACE questionnaire but don't go on to become overweight or engage in drug taking or to get, heart disease, cancer, things like that, when compared with the people that do, unfortunately, either fall into those traps or get those diseases?
Two-part answer. The first part of the answer would be, in the way you're describing it, you're leaving out an analysis of biomedical disease. You're verging onto the issue of resilience.
Right.
Okay. It would be very easy to say of Judge Bullock, who wrote that extraordinary autobiography that you can sample on Amazon, Bullock, Judging Me is the title of the autobiography. It would be very easy to say, isn't it wonderful that she's so resilient? Look at, she's a United States federal judge, etc. But then, you open up the issue of biomedical disease as a function of resiliency or lack thereof. You've really widened it out. one of the major American medical researchers on resiliency is a woman named Emmy Werner. And I believe it's on the bottom of page 67 of her book. She mentions how when they were studying their most resilient patients, how surprised they were to find this remarkably high level of biomedical disease in patients who psychosocially were very resilient. In other words, had done well economically, socially, academically, etc., for themselves. So the other part of the answer is I believe that to the degree resilience exists, and it does exist, but it's always partial. I've never seen anyone go back to the status quo ante as though nothing had ever happened. It's largely a function of the firmly held belief that at least somewhere, sometime, there was somebody to whom one really mattered. Probably not your mother or father, otherwise we wouldn't be talking about resiliency, but somebody important to whom one mattered.
Right, okay. Vincent, this has been one of those interviews where it's given me like a million different sort of issues and topics that I could sort of branch out into now. Some of these interviews tend to sort of spawn a multitude of other interviews, and I think this is going to be one of those. But before I let you go, I'm going to subject you to the quickfire question round, which, as people know by now, is only available to those people who are supporting us on Patreon. So if you would like access to these little bits of bonus content, just go to patreon.com/Maui. That's MOWE. And you can donate for as little as $2 a month and gain access to exclusive content, including these quickfire question portions. But before we jump into that, Vincent, have you got any links, social media, websites, anything you'd like to make the listeners aware of?
Yeah, I think if you simply use the term ACE study and look on the internet and YouTube, you'll be surprised how many pages of information and citations are there. And then an excellent blog is ACES Connection, ACES Connection.com. And another one, ACES Too High, ACESTOOHIGH.com. Those are excellent blogs that have huge amounts of information in them. So I would recommend anyone look at those.
Okay, perfect. As always, I will include links to those in the show notes. So, okay, Vincent, let's start with this one. So, firstly, if you could tell me the last book you read, the best book you've ever read, and then a book recommendation on this particular topic, please.
The last book I've read, I'm currently reading, and that's Robert Woodward's book about Trump, the so-called President of the United States.
Okay, not a fan then.
And the title of that book is Fear. A quite good and engaging book. Probably the most important book I can think of is titled Enlightenment Now, and the author's name is Pinker, Pinker.
Steven Pinker, yes.
Yeah. I found that an extremely interesting book because it dealt with so many things of importance, providing a long view of what was happening in terms of change, and surprisingly reassuring.
What's it about exactly, Vincent?
Well, how things were commonly improving, even though, we may be miserable with the situation at the moment. But when one takes a long view and looks at what things were like a couple of 100 years ago or 50 years ago and now, clear-cut improvement in a whole range of subjects. So that that book I was very impressed with.
Okay, and a book recommendation on this topic, if there is one.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking before that a book that an author you might enjoy looking at is a physician in Norway, Anna Louise Kirkingen, Kirkingen. She has several books. It would make most sense to look at them on Amazon and sample them. But a really impressive book she did is called Inscribed Bodies, and the title implies that it's about the inscription of life experience on bodily function.
Oh, wow.
Extremely well done. She might be a good, person for you to talk with and conceivably think about interviewing.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is another topic that I don't think this idea of embodied trauma, I don't think it's quite made its way into the mainstream and the general public, because this is something that's it wasn't until I delved into the topic of mental health and psychology quite deeply before I discovered you, before I discovered there's a guy called Bessel van der Kolk. All the same sort of concepts, but it's not mainstream yet. So yeah, it's definitely a rabbit hole. I'm going to make some effort into diving down, I think.
Well, a little piece of factual information worth keeping in mind. In all of medicine, there are only 3 sources of diagnostic information: patient history, physical examination, and laboratory studies. If you ask patients, and I have literally done this of 10,000 some years ago by questionnaire, overwhelmingly, patients assume diagnosis comes out of lab tests. Doctor, I want all the blood tests. Yeah, right. You don't have enough blood in your body for all of the blood tests. If you ask experienced physicians, they'll tell you that about 75% of the time, diagnosis comes from patient history. The problem with that is it's time consuming, it's experience dependent, it's fraught with interpersonal difficulties. Well, this doctor's too young this one's too old to understand. Yeah, I'd rather talk with the lady doctor about this. I'd rather talk with somebody who was Polish or Korean like me that would understand me better, etc. And what we found there was that one can avoid all of those problems by initially getting the information by an inert mechanism. By us, paper, probably better still on the internet. So a huge advance would be to develop a really comprehensive medical history questionnaire, put it on the internet, enabling patients to fill this out at home, add their name and address after they've disconnected from the internet and downloaded, their answers, and if they wish, print that out and provide to their physicians.
Yeah, you may have preempted my next question with that answer, Vincent. It might go a different direction, but if you could take the reins of power at the Department of Health, what policy would you implement to improve the mental well-being of the general public?
Oh, that there's no question about.
Okay, folks, if you enjoyed this episode or you're enjoying this podcast in general and you'd like to help support it, this is just a quick message to let you know that you can now join our little exclusive members-only community over at Patreon, where for as little as $2 a month, you can gain access to exclusive content like the quickfire questions portion from my interviews and my AMA or Ask Me Anything episodes. There's also a members-only newsletter where I give you a little sneak peek into what kind of guests and content to expect over the coming weeks. You can help me steer the ship a little bit by telling me the kind of content you'd like me to produce, and there's also the opportunity to join a private Facebook group where you can interact directly with myself and fellow patrons to share tips and advice and support one another on your own mental health recovery journeys. So if this sounds like a community you'd like to be a part of, please go to patreon.com/Maui, that's MOWE, and sign up for as little as $2 a month, which, let's face it, is less than the price of a coffee, and not even one of them like fancy double Belgian chocolate latte bollocks. It's probably cheaper than like a plain old shitty Nescafe from the office vending machine, and it won't give you the jitters or make your breath smell of arse, so bargain. Alternatively, for those of you who do want to help support the podcast, but you can't be arsed with all the extra bells and whistles, you can make a standard one-time or monthly donation by going to our support page at myownworstenemy.org/support. And that's about it. So, as always, thank you for listening, and I'll see you again next time.